Before we dive into the practical tools and frameworks, I'd like to start with a simple idea. What happens when we bring together the power of clear logic and the depth of conscious presence? On one side, we have the theory of constraints, a body of knowledge that teaches us how to think logically about systems. It shows us that every process, every organization is limited by a few key constraints, and that by addressing those constraints intelligently, we can unlock enormous performance and flow. On the other side, we have time to think, a framework that teaches us how to create the conditions in which people can think well for themselves. It reminds us that human beings do their best reasoning not under pressure or interruption, but in an atmosphere of attention, ease, and equality. When we bring these two together, something quite extraordinary happens. TOC gives us the structure of thought, the logic, the clarity, the cause and effect reasoning. Time to think gives us the quality of thought, the presence, the safety, the inner spaciousness from which insight can arise. Together, they form a bridge between logic and consciousness, between how we reason and how we relate. This bridge allows us not only to see the constraints in our systems, but also to release the constraints in our minds. It's a way of combining analytical intelligence with emotional and ethical intelligence, producing decisions that are not only effective but deeply human. So, in this session, we'll explore what happens when we allow logic and consciousness to collaborate, when structured thinking meets liberated thinking, and how that combination can transform both our organizations and ourselves. Note, the world-classing thinking framework is based upon three foundational pillars. As a reminder, Pillar 1 is Getting Things Done, GTD, which is used to free up mental capacity and to reduce stress by getting upcoming work out of our minds and into a trusted system of record. Pillar 2 is the Theory of Constraints, TOC, which provide a very powerful set of system thinking processes and tools which can be used to diagnose what is wrong with the system and how to transform that system based upon the goals that have been set. Having an appreciation of TOC will certainly help you to better understand this section more, but it is not mandatory. Indeed, you can always come back at a later date when that appreciation of TOC is in place. Important note, we won't cover every potential consideration around the integration of TOC and time to think. As you come to understand TOC better yourself through practice and experience, you may find that you discover your own personal and unique insight around how TOC and time to think complement and amplify each other. Should that be the case, we would welcome feedback so that others may benefit. Logic and consciousness, the bridge between two worlds. We can think of TOC and time to think as two complementary hemispheres of the same brain. Interestingly, this is not an abstract metaphor. Combining TOC and time to think actually helps to better integrate and utilize the brain's hemispheres. Looking at the diagram on the left of the slide, we illustrate which functions are associated to the right brain or left brain hemispheres. The idea of a left-brained or right-brained personality is a myth, but hemispheric specialization is real. Here's what science tells us. Left hemisphere processes language, including grammar and vocabulary, handles math and logic, and controls the right side of the body. It also manages speech production and supports language comprehension. Right hemisphere specializes in spatial awareness, facial recognition, emotional processing, and controls the left side of the body. It is also more active in interpreting negative emotions and visualizing complex patterns. Although these functions are typically lateralized, most tasks involve cooperation between both hemispheres. For example, while the left hemisphere may handle grammar, the right helps interpret tone and emotional context. TOC brings the rigor of logic, the ability to trace cause and effect, to see how one part of a system constrains the whole. Time to think brings the consciousness of presence, the ability to listen deeply, suspend judgment, and allow new thinking to emerge. When combined, we integrate clarity of logic with quality of awareness. This combination enables world-class thinking, where rational precision and reflective consciousness coexist. As you can see in the diagram, we have labeled time to think as being a right brain function and TOC as being a left brain function. This is a very simplistic biological and psychological view, which makes it easier for us to understand ourselves a bit better. However, no function sits only in one part of the brain. As humans, we are extremely complex entities. Any accurate definition of what a human system is ultimately has to encapsulate biology, chemistry, quantum mechanics, consciousness, the list goes on. When we are able to bridge multiple worlds, we start to gain a deeper appreciation of ourselves and our true nature. We then slowly get to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Time to think, we will abbreviate it to TTT, and the theory of constraints, TOC, while developed from very different traditions, are deeply complementary to each other. Both disciplines are about liberating flow. In TOC, it is the flow of value created by system itself, and also the value that flowing through the system. In TTT, it is the flow of thought through a mind or group. When combined, they create a closed-loop system that integrates logic and consciousness, process and presence, thinking and wisdom together. Organizations must deal with two kinds of constraints. The first are external and structural: bottlenecks, policy constraints, poor processes. TOC gives us the tools to reveal and remove them. The second are internal and psychological: fear, ego, haste, lack of listening. Time to think helps us dissolve these. When we only fix the external constraints in the systems, then the internal constraints within our minds will ultimately recreate the same or similar set of problems over time. Enterprise IT is a classic example of this problem, in which there is a periodic transformation to try and clean up a large volume of technical debt that has accrued over time, only for technical debt to grow over time again. As Albert Einstein famously said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. When we attend to both external and internal constraints, we get a true transformation, systems that flow because people can think freely and clearly. Integration unites outer process efficiency with inner cognitive clarity. When we talk about integrating outer process efficiency with inner cognitive clarity, we're describing the meeting point between the mechanics of performance and the consciousness that drives it. The theory of constraints gives us tools to create outer process efficiency. It teaches us to see the system as a flow of interdependent activities, define the constraint that limits throughput, to focus effort where it matters most, and to elevate performance with precision and logic. It's about how work moves, the choreography of the system itself. But as every leader knows, even the most elegant process can fail if the people inside it are unclear, defensive, or rushed. That's where time to think enters. It develops inner cognitive clarity. It addresses how thought moves by creating an environment of attention, ease, and equality that allows people to think for themselves, to surface unspoken assumptions, and to reach fresh insight. When these two domains connect, something profound happens. Outer process efficiency stops being mechanical, and inner cognitive clarity stops being abstract. The process improves because people are thinking well, and people think well because the process supports them. It becomes a single feedback loop between the flow of work and the flow of thought. For example, when a TOC improvement removes a systemic bottleneck, say an approval delay or resource conflict, it also reduces mental friction. People feel more ease and confidence, which enhances their capacity to think. Conversely, when a TTT practice clears mental clutter by revealing a false assumption or creating an atmosphere of attention, it leads to better diagnosis of the system constraint and better design of the solution. So outer efficiency and inner clarity are not two separate projects. They are two expressions of the same principle:
flow. One deals with the flow of value through a process. The other deals with the flow of awareness through a mind or team. When both flow freely, the organization becomes not just productive, but intelligent, able to think as clearly as it operates. Organizations must deal with two kinds of constraints. The first are external and structural: bottlenecks, policy constraints, poor processes. TOC gives us the tools to reveal and remove them. The second are internal and psychological: fear, ego, haste, lack of listening. Time to think helps us dissolve these. When we only fix the external, the internal recreates the same problems. When we attend to both, we get a true transformation, systems that flow because people can think freely and clearly.
The closed-loop concept. When we talk about integrating time to think and the theory of constraints, we're really describing two dimensions of the same system of intelligence, one external, one internal. In TOC, our goal is to improve the flow of value. We identify constraints in a process, understand cause and effect, and redesign the system so that energy moves smoothly and productively. In TTT, our goal is to improve the flow of thought. We identify constraints in people's minds, assumptions, interruptions, power imbalances, and redesign the thinking environment so that insight flows freely. When these two are connected, something powerful happens. They form a closed feedback loop between logic and consciousness. Logic clarifies reality. It shows us what's true in the external world. Consciousness refines perception. It shows us how we are seeing that world. Each feeds the other. Better logic sharpens awareness. Deeper awareness purifies logic. In practice, this means we start with presence, creating a space for calm, generative thinking. From that foundation, we use logical tools such as current reality trees, conflict resolution diagrams, etc., to map what's happening in the relevant systems. As we build these maps, we bring conscious attention to the assumptions embedded in them, often through incisive questions. That reflection improves the integrity of our logic. Once change is implemented through TOC, we return again to presence, reflecting on what we've learned, sensing how the system and the people have shifted. Each cycle strengthens both clarity and consciousness. This is what makes it a closed loop. Consciousness improves logic. Logic improves systems. Systems improve experience. Experience deepens consciousness. Ultimately, the objective is to make the organization becomes as self-correcting as possible in real time. And with the deployment of continuously evolving AI systems, this eventually leads to a thinking system that learns from its own awareness. We evolve from mechanical problem-solving toward living intelligence, where process and presence, thinking and wisdom move as one continuous current. The closed-loop concept describes how time to think and the theory of constraints continually reinforce one another. In this slide, we will explore where that integration actually happens across four key dimensions that connect logic and consciousness, process and presence, thinking and wisdom. The first dimension is logic and consciousness. TOC gives us logic, the discipline of cause and effect reasoning, of building logic trees and tracing dependencies until we can see what's truly driving performance. Time to think brings consciousness, the awareness of how assumptions, emotion, and attention shape the way we interpret that logic. When these two meet, we get insight that is not just accurate, but awake. Clarity is no longer mechanical, it becomes compassionate. The second dimension is process and presence. TOC focuses on process, flow, throughput, bottlenecks, the mechanics of improvement. Time to think focuses on presence, the human state that allows good thinking to happen in the first place. When process and presence integrate, productivity stops being forced. It becomes sustainable, human-centered, and even graceful. People no longer feel squeezed by the system. They feel supported by it. The third dimension is thinking and wisdom. TOC excels at analytical thinking, understanding what's happening and why. Time to think cultivates reflective wisdom, the ability to pause, to sense the deeper implications of our conclusions. Together, thinking and wisdom create decisions that are both intelligent and ethical. The organization doesn't just get faster, it gets wiser. And finally, the fourth dimension, constraint and liberation. TOC is all about finding and removing constraints, the physical, procedural, or policy limits that slow a system down. Time to think is about liberation, releasing the mental and emotional constraints that slow people down. When we address both, we free not just the process, but the mind behind the process. That's when the real transformation begins. When flow becomes both external and internal. So, these four dimensions are not separate categories. They are interdependent fields of movement. Logic shapes consciousness. Consciousness refines logic. Process enables presence. Presence humanizes process. Thinking becomes wisdom. Constraint becomes liberation. And together, these dynamics form a living system, one that continually evolves toward greater clarity, flow, and collective intelligence. Let's look at the relationship between the TOC and TTT in a slightly different way, using the table in the slide as a point of reference. First, as you know, TOC's goal is to identify the core constraint or root cause, the bottleneck that governs the system's performance. TTT's contribution is to create a space where that constraint can be explored without defensiveness, where people can reflect on how their own assumptions or emotions may reinforce it. Together, they turn a structural diagnosis into a living systems inquiry, one that includes both logic and consciousness. Second, TOC uses the logical thinking processes, tools like the I/O map or current reality tree, to build rigorous cause and effect chains. When those sessions take place within a thinking environment, with attention, ease, and equality as ground rules, something shifts. Debate turns into dialogue. People stop defending and start discovering. The analysis becomes deeper because it's safer. Third, TOC helps us decide what to change to, and how to cause the change. TTT enhances this phase through incisive questions that bring intuition and wisdom into the decision process. The outcome isn't just a good solution, it's a solution people actually believe in, one that aligns with both intellect and integrity. Fourth, TOC teaches us that every change meets resistance, the famous layers of resistance model. TTT provides the antidote by helping people surface and question the limiting assumptions that sit beneath that resistance. It transforms resistance from an obstacle into a doorway, a moment to ask, what are we assuming here that might not be true? Finally, TOC drives improvement through measurement and throughput. TTT sustains it through psychological safety and reflective practice. It keeps the human system calm enough to keep thinking when pressure rises. When combined, these two disciplines create a kind of dual operating system for transformation. TOC provides the structure, the skeleton of cause and effect. TTT provides the soul, the consciousness that animates it. Together, they ensure that improvement is not just efficient, but enlightened. Logic identifies what must change in the system. Wisdom reveals what must change in us to make that change possible. This is how TOC and TTT amplify each other, turning continuous improvement into continuous awakening.
So far, we've looked at the theory, the idea that when we combine time to think and the theory of constraints, we create a closed-loop system that unites logic and consciousness. But what does that actually look like in practice? How does this integration show up in the rhythm of real organizational work? It begins with presence, the first step of the loop. Before we apply logic, we create space. We begin with a thinking round, a pause, or a few moments of ease, so that people arrive as thinkers, not as reactors. This is the foundation of time to think. Without presence, logic is rushed and partial. Presence stabilizes attention. It slows the pace just enough for clarity to enter. From there, we move to logic, the second phase. Now that the atmosphere is calm, we can apply the tools of the theory of constraints. Mapping cause and effect, building a current reality tree, identifying the core conflict or constraint. This is where analysis thrives, but now it's grounded in awareness, not anxiety. Next comes conscious reflection, the third step. As we test our logic, we ask incisive questions. What assumptions are we making? What might we be taking for granted? What else could be true? These questions, drawn from the TTT discipline, cleanse our reasoning. They help to ensure that our TOC diagrams reflect truth, not bias, as our egos are gently moved to one side. This is where consciousness refines logic. Then we move into process change, the fourth step. Having clarified both the system and the assumptions, we act. We implement the solutions, remove the constraint, or realign the policy. This is classic TOC execution, but now it's powered by a deeper awareness of human dynamics, so the change is not just effective, but embraced. Finally, we return to wisdom, the fifth and closing step, which leads back into presence. We pause again. We harvest the learning. We ask, what have we discovered, not just about the system, but about how we think together? This reflective step transforms data into insight and action into understanding. And from that wisdom, the next cycle begins, richer, calmer, and more conscious than the last. So the closed loop in action follows this living rhythm. Presence plus logic plus reflection plus process change plus wisdom plus presence again. Each turn strengthens both the analytical and the human sides of the organization. Over time, the system learns to think, not mechanically, but mindfully. And that is how we build organizations that are not only intelligent, but self-aware.
When we bring all of this together, the logic of TOC and the consciousness of time to think, what emerges is not just a better process, but a better quality of collective mind. At the systems level, we see clarity and flow. Processes align. Bottlenecks dissolve. Decision-making becomes faster and cleaner because it's guided by logical cause and effect reasoning. The organization starts to move as one coherent system rather than a collection of competing parts. At the human level, we see ease and trust. The atmosphere changes. Meetings become spaces of genuine listening rather than polite competition. People begin to think for themselves, not just react to others. The speed of thought slows down just enough for depth and originality to surface. And when these two levels meet, when logic informs structure and consciousness informs culture, something remarkable happens. We create thinking environments that combine precision with compassion, efficiency with empathy. People and processes stop working against each other and start evolving together. In that state, performance accelerates naturally. Teams think faster because they feel safer. Systems improve because people have room to think. The organization becomes self-correcting. It learns, it reflects, it grows. In effect, it becomes a living intelligence.
logical enough to be efficient, conscious enough to be ethical. So the true outcome of combining time to think and the theory of constraints is not just smarter problem solving, it's wise problem solving. It's an organizational mind that unites clarity with care, thinking with feeling, structure with soul. And that is the kind of intelligence the future demands, one that is not only effective, but deeply human. Well, that brings us to the end of this section on integrating TOC and time to think. In the next section, we will stay on the same subject, but dive deeper using some actual examples.